commensality, cum mensa, sharing the table, and what's on it. Grüezi miteinander. That's about all I'm going to say in German or in Schweizerdeutsch. But I would like to talk, it's a difficult enterprise, both about the software and the hardware and the relationship between the two. Culture would be the software. And what's underneath it and how does it interact? So let me bring my computer on the lectern here and start with a title which probably would need 2 hours to develop. Okay, we do have innovations in the history of mankind, of humankind, that became absolutely basic to us, but for some reason took ages until they were accepted and used. Look at this. Tomato looks so common today. Can you imagine Italy without the tomato? When do you think that was? Tomato came from the Americas in the 16th century. It wasn't present around the Mediterranean as a basic thing until the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th. So there wasn't no tomato sauce in any kind of pasta or pizza in Italy before 1800 or so. Hard to imagine, right? And the potato took 300 years. And at the beginning, they knew the potato in the 15th for the 16th century, but they got confused. You know, there was something underneath the ground that they found that, you know, they called by the same term that as the potato. It was truffles. Truffles, Kartoffel, Kartoffel, Tartufo, it's the same word. So they were confusing truffles for potato and vice versa. So basically, our relationship to foods is a very complex one, and we have the software, the culture, and I'd like to make you think, in order to try and understand how these things can work. It's a little abstract, but I'd like you to think of cuisines. I call food cultures cuisines. I would make this point that it's like language in a way. Think of cuisine like a language with some of the features. All humans speak, but they speak different languages, okay? They all eat, but they eat different cuisines. So you have to understand that cuisines are like languages in the sense that they have rules, implicit rules that you could call grammar or syntax that you don't think of. You don't realize you're applying until they're broken. Last night, Fischler, who is going to tell us about Chinese food later on, told us, I don't see her, but she told us about her experience upon returning from China after a long stay at the beginning. She decided to cook something for her friends, and it was an apple tart. And for some reason, she added cucumber slices and was it strawberries? And everybody was shocked because you don't put cucumber on a tart. Why wouldn't you? Well, that's what I call the grammar, the implicit grammar, that it's just like language. When it's broken and a foreigner makes a mistake or a funny, it results in laughter or misunderstanding or something like that. It goes exactly the same, not exactly, but a bit the same with food and cuisines. So just like language is universal in the sense that all humans speak, language is local, cuisines, eating is universal and cuisines are local. They can have local inflections, regional inflections, you can have accents, you can have local peculiarities and everything. So what I want to do is put all this in perspective in a very little time, but the first point is I want to tell you about the human omnivore. Being an omnivore, what's the hardware doing that changes or influences the software and vice versa? And I want to talk about cuisines and what is their function relating to omnivorousness. And we'll go on after that. The seminal thing here is a paper from 1976 by my friend and longtime colleague, collaborator, friend, etc., Paul Rosen. It's about the selection of foods by non-specialist species. Non-specialist meaning not needing only one kind of food to survive. So the title says a lot already: rats, humans, and other animals. And that paper makes the point that being an omnivore brings about a dilemma. The Omnivore's Dilemma has also been the title of a book by Michael Pollan, who paid homage to Paul. I like to talk about a paradox rather than a dilemma. Here's how it works. Regarding innovation, an omnivore is free to innovate, in theory. Biologically, he or she is not like the Australian, the koala, who needs a particular species of eucalyptus tree to survive, and if the environment doesn't provide that anymore, the species is gone. We can adjust, and the main feature is adjustability, adaptability. But we're free to change diet, but changing diet is dangerous. We don't know what's novel could be toxic. So we have to be extremely prudent, careful. So it's safety first, but at the same time we have diversity, that is a freedom, but it is also a must for us. We do not, in a way, we do not have a choice. We have to have a diverse diet, minimally diverse, because we are not biologically able to synthesize all the essential amino acids that we need, okay? So diversity is not just a freedom, it is an obligation. So look at this way. The same creature is at the same time neophobic, as we say in lingo, neophobic and neophilic. We are neophobes and neophiles. Now, it sounds like some Jewish jokes about the mother that offers for his birthday her son a red tie and a blue tie, and the next day he shows up with the red tie and she says, "I see you don't like the blue one." So it's a double bind. How do we get out of the double bind? Paul has this phrase, familiarity breeds content, and its first predictor for acceptability of a food is familiarity. And familiarity breeds contempt. You cannot go every day and eat the same thing, exactly the same thing, the same one thing. You just can't, biologically speaking. So there's no wonder that the human omnivore is extremely anxious a creature. My point is that we can understand the function of cuisines, and the function of cuisines is precisely to help us solve the paradox of the omnivore. And how's that working? We have those culinary techniques and rules. A cuisine is more than just ingredients and ways to prepare them. As I said, it's about rules and organization of the things. It's not just the elements, it's the relationships between the elements, okay? So if you have a novel food and you have a local cuisine, you can think of ways to accommodate it to the local cuisine. You can use a sauce, or you can find the slot in the grid where it can fit or match. So you make it more familiar by cooking it your way. You can make it fit in a familiar pattern. If you have too familiar, too common foods, then you make them more diverse by using novel recipes, using different combinations. For instance, you go to Portugal and you see they eat bacalhau, dried cod, every day. So they tell you almost every day. And they say, but we have more than 365 recipes. So you can make up diversity in something that is the same basic ingredient. And also, the important thing that Nick suggested at one point is when it's in the culture, you don't have to make decisions necessarily. It goes without saying. Its culture is when things go without saying. It's an underlying software, as it were, that allows you to function without, wondering too much and being too much. It solves it for a large part. It solves the anxiety thing that I mentioned. So we need to make fewer or no decisions, and making decisions can be a drag on you. So once you have this mechanism or this system in mind, you can try to figure out how innovation can make its way into a cuisine. What you see is, the general principles in one slide. You can make a book out of this, but there's a process of downward and upward substitution, okay? For instance, if you have a food that you can say is a medicine, or even before you think of it as food, it usually will have a good chance of succeeding. At least if we look back to history, we see that chocolate began like that, and more surprisingly, sugar began like that. Sugar was a medicine before it was an ingredient. And same for chocolate, coffee, etc. They all have this past. You can use it for status acquisition. You can make more noble a product. And there's the story, a recent story about 20 years ago in France, where you have a famous writer, Céline, writes about nouilles, noodles. And he makes it sound terrible. It's like the poor people's food, and they used to cook it in vessels that were used to make the laundry, so it smelled of washing powder and that sort of things. But in the 90s, thanks to Barilla, for instance, in France, for instance, they turned noodles into pasta, which was presented on a cushion as if it was a jewel. So you can change the status of the food with good management, but you can change the eater's image through good self-management. That is, if you change your way of eating, if there's prestige associated with the food, well, you can climb up the social ladder, at least symbolically. Historically, the potato, for instance, and other crops acquired the dominance they have in certain culture only in a gradual way. The potato was a complement in times of shortages of wheat. If you read Salomon, there's the big book, history book on the potato. It's basically that. It was filling the gap, filling the needs when the shortages were too bad. And gradually it took the place, it substituted to this. The same processes are more or less at work when it comes to maize and wheat in Mexico, wheat gaining more and more space, etc. Now, I already mentioned the example of the bacalhau and the diversity game in Portugal. And basically, if you can reconcile one slot in the grid that is a cuisine or a food culture, you have a chance of that you can put something new in it. There's a dozen of other examples, but I would be too long. So mimesis, differentiation, distinction, identifications are all psychological or psychosocial mechanisms that you can use or happen when it comes to receiving, accepting innovation. And this, I want to make this point at this point of the talk. This all is why, there is one reason why food can just never be a consumer good like any other. And I'm telling this to people who probably know it, or certainly know it already professionally, people in marketing and in the food business. It's not just, of course, it's not a commodity, and it's not just another consumer good. Why is that? Well, there's a very good reason, and that's called magical thinking or cognitive bias by the current theories. In the 19th century, the anthropologists, the first ones, found that in the so-called primitive cultures they were analyzing, there were two laws of people's perception of things and the world. One was contagion, once in contact, always in contact. If you touch something that is not the purity you can expect, you are contaminated. You need rituals of purifications and everything. Once in contact, always in contact. And there's this law of similarity. Image equals object. You don't like someone, you take a little statue, you say this is the person, you pierce it with needles and everything, and you're supposed to have, analogically speaking, the same results on the person. That's magical thinking, okay? And it's just the savages. No, it's us too. It's an underlying layer of our psyche, and it works like that. Of course, we can overcome it. We overcome it. But if you look at advertising for food, you find it's all over. It's all over the place. I remember a long time ago, there was, since we're close of the Alps, the commercials for Evian water across the Geneva Lake in the shade of the mountains. The campaign was about Evian gives you what the glaciers gave it. So what did the glaciers and the mountains give it? Something very symbolic here: elevation, closeness to the sky, purity from the glaciers, etc. You drink what you are. You are what you drink. Exactly what I'm driving at. Contagion plus similarity, you are what you eat, and once in contact, always in contact. That's the essence of this cognitive bias, which is quite universal, or is it a heuristic? In the terms of current cognitive psychology, it doesn't matter, but it's pretty much universal. I know that the Germans will say that so-and-so said, man ist, was man ist, the local wise guy, etc. But it's a universal way of thinking. And if you are what you eat, you want to know what you eat. You want to know what your children and beloved ones eat. And what people complain of when it comes to processed food is precisely, we do not know what we eat. And that has been going on not since last year, but for several decades. As long as I've been working on these issues, I've heard this: you don't know what you eat. So that's the mechanism. See, you are what you eat. Food cultures, bridging the gap or the paradox of the omnivore. And now if you compare cultures, you see that it's like languages. Languages remain the same language, but they evolve. So they remain different from each other. The French or the English or the German we speak today is different from the one we spoke in the 18th, 19th, 20th century, or even 10 years ago. Intonations, expressions, all this evolves and changes. And it's the same with food cultures, but they tend to remain identifiable. So over 25 years with Paul Rosen and other colleagues, we've been comparing food cultures in what is called the Western world, as if it was one culture, one world. You know, people often, particularly in the health professions, they often refer to Western diet, the Western cultures, and so on. There's no such thing as Western diet. And we show that there are considerable differences between countries that have basically the same level of development and could be expected to be exposed and are exposed to the same novel trends. So to summarize some of the most striking differences between French, for instance, and US food cultures as they appear in our research over a long period of time, I've extracted a few dimensions. Of course, we've looked at other countries, but those are the two polarities, the two poles. So on the American side, the big thing is the notion of choice. Choice is a term that comes up very often in discourse nowadays, but it's more American than anything else. And the way of talking about food when we did qualitative, quantitative research, focus groups, interviews, extended interviews, and questionnaires on large samples, so you have it all. It comes out like this. When they talk about food in the US, it's mostly in nutritional terms these days. So if you ask them, pick two words that go best together among the three that we're going to tell you now, you say bread, pasta, sauce. Which are the two that go best together? Americans will say bread, used to say in our research, bread and pasta, because probably they're starch. Now the French massively say pasta and sauce. It's a dish. So on the one hand, people think in culinary terms, and the other hand, they think in nutritional terms. You have other things that work well, but there is a background of personal responsibility. That's probably Protestant ethics, as Max Weber described it. You are the one responsible for your current state. People talk about the easy going out, the easy trade-off. It's easy to trade off. I know it's not right. I know I don't do what I should, but it's so easy to have trade-offs. I'm responsible. Lately, you can begin, gradually you begin to incriminate larger things that could be incriminated, corporations or government or culture or whatever. And when you talk to people, when you experience interactions over food, you realize that this is gradually increasing over the beginning of the 21st century, and it's really coming to a massive thing nowadays. The meal is a contract, while on the other hand, and I'm explaining this, on the other side, it's a communion. The French or the Italians sit around the table, eat the same dish, are extremely conscious of the other people, that is in the typical model. The decisions they have to make are in accordance to the community around the table, and eating the same stuff implicitly, and that's very Catholic after all, it's communing, yes. Eating the same stuff makes you produce the same flesh and the same blood. So gets you closer to each other in some very powerful way. So you feel that if you don't eat the same thing as the rest of the people, you might be sort of excommunicated. Whereas in the American situation, you have lunch with a colleague at the university and you negotiate. You negotiate about the place, about the type of food, you convene, you talk, you eat, you spend half an hour, 45 minutes, say hello, goodbye, and that's that. It's a contract. Responsible and free individuals coming to an agreement after a negotiation. There's none of the, or very little of the communion side that, not that people don't enjoy being together. We ran experience happiness studies in 3 cities, Columbus, Ohio, Odense, Denmark, Rennes, France, over 3,400 women, and eating alone is everywhere appreciated and enjoyed less than eating with someone, anyone, in all situations. Typical dimension of the US relationship to food when I say about choice. I mean, maximizing choice is good. You see, we asked people, this is inspired by Baskin-Robbins advertising 50 flavors, etc., of light ice cream. So we devised this question. You want to eat ice cream, you have a choice between 2 ice cream parlors. One offers 50 flavors. The other a selection of 10. Which of the 2 do you prefer? Price is equal. Everybody, the Swiss to begin with, you know, they think that 10 is enough. Choosing from 10 is enough. The US sample is the only one that has a majority of people who think 50 is better. I presented this once in a conference in Montreal, and there was a Harvard economist, I forget his name, who raised his hand. He said very politely, I have no reason to doubt your data, but why would people prefer less than more? And I thought that was in and of itself rather typically US in culture. Okay, we know that portion size are different in France and the US in restaurants, supermarkets, cookbooks. We investigated this with sending students with precision scales in restaurants, similar restaurants on both sides. It's invariably, except in one occasion, more copious in the States than it's in France. If you look at the size of yogurt jars, it's really striking. I forgot to put up a slide of that. So you have, for instance, even at McDonald's, they denied this when we published it, but then they have to come to agree about it. And if you go to the local Chinese restaurant, there's something like I don't have it on this slide. Well, never mind. I mean, there was something like 25% more food on the Philadelphia plate than in Paris. Now, if you look at meal times, that's fascinating. Meal times is one of the most stable features of a food culture. The National Statistical Institutes of major countries produce these time use studies that are very heavy and very difficult to do. People have a little booklet, and every 15 minutes they note what they're doing. Okay, tens of thousands of people, so they don't do it very often. And they're actually in the process of revising the whole procedure now. But anyway, look at the times of day and when people are eating. So the blue line here is the French, and the red line is the UK. So you see that on any given day at 12:30, 54.1% of the French were eating, whereas the highest point in Britain was a little later, 1:10 p.m. or something like that, and there were only 17.6% eating at the same time. You have that very consistently. You find it between France and the US. It's absolutely spectacular, as you can see. It doesn't move very much over time, at least it didn't between 1986 and 2010. You see it's the gradual little bit up there that is the increase. But it's constant. More recent data from the Eurobarometers show this. That French are the most uniform meal times and stay there. And we have our own data, which I mentioned earlier, from Columbus, Odense, and Rennes. Basically, that's very consistent. You have the time people eat or drink every day. So look at this. France, 2 hours, 13 minutes. Italy, 2 hours, 7 minutes. United States, 1 hour, 2 minutes. And somehow twice the rate of obesity, almost 3 times at some points they have in France. Now that's a little difficult to understand. If you look at the curve of meal times, you see that there's pretty much some eating activity going on all day in the US samples, but there's probably some that goes unreported because it's not associated as to an identifiable event. Sales of caloric beverages, look at this. France is here in the bottom with Italy, with Spain and similar countries. And this leads us to think, and I need to close up on this because the timer here is not working well. I'm too long? Much too long? Okay, let me close. Sorry. All right, look at this. We're hunter-gatherers for 99% of the time we've spent on the planet, so we're nomadic, coming to a question that was raised. We're nomadic, so nomadism is probably present somehow in our makeup. But anyway, after agriculture, the state, governments, etc., religion, what you have this kind of commensal situation, okay? Look at the kids here on the left while they are saying grace. It's unlikely that the kids are going to be allowed or even think of saying, I'd like fries instead of beans. It's not going to happen, not in this meal. Okay? Everybody is going to eat the same thing according to rules and taking into account the collective rather than the individual, to make it simple. Same in something that doesn't look very elaborate and civilized to us, but is actually extremely strict in terms of preeminence, where you're allowed to eat, with what hand, etc., and so on. So what is changing, something very basic is changing here. And because we're going from this in 60 years' time, a Thanksgiving during the war and the meanings associated to it, the joys on the faces, the rejoicement on the faces, the meaning, freedom from want and freedom period, etc. Okay? Now 60 years later, there's this cartoon in the New Yorker, the last Thanksgiving, no turkey in the center, a balloon on top of each head. One is can't have salt, the other one is vegetarian, the third one has gluten-free, one is picky gourmet, etc., and so on. So they can't get to agree on what to put in the middle of the table. So there's no going to what I mentioned earlier with communing and sharing the same food. It's a different set of values that will have to be elaborated. And this has been discussed in a conference a few years back. But basically, and I'll finish with this, look at what challenge we're exposed now. We have these three revolutions that, I think it was three, that Lucas alluded to, and I couldn't agree more. Animal rights, gender and sex, and the technology revolutions, etc. Now, we have to devise a new way of relating to food and relating to each other based on, the freedom that each of us is acquiring, has acquired with differences along cultures. And I'm not going to promote one against the other. I can't do that as a social scientist. I shouldn't do that. What I'm observing is that we seem to be going, for the better or worse, towards the following direction. There's the ordinary and the extraordinary. It's always been like that, will some of you tell me? Yeah, pretty much. But the inventor of a product called Soylent, which is supposed to substitute for food, real food, it's a powder, it has all the necessary nutrients. You spend $50 a month on it to feed yourself instead of, say, $450 at the time of development. He's interviewed the promoter, the creator of the startup, which is not a startup anymore now, although he's not the president anymore. So Rob Reinhardt is interviewed, and some guy says, you live on this? He says, yes, most of the time. He says, don't you miss sometimes a good dinner at a restaurant with good friends? And he says, I have nothing against recreational eating. So recreational eating versus ordinary eating, is that what we're going towards? I don't know, but I mean, we have to think hard what we want to do about this. And we can probably find solutions, but they won't be the same as the one in the days of turkey in the middle of the table for everybody. Apparently, unless something very serious happens, it may happen, we're not into this direction, for better or worse. Thank you very much.